Alan Aragon is a nutrition researcher and educator with over 30 years of success in his field. He is known to be one of the most influential figures in the fitness industry movement towards evidence-based information, and he is just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so excited to have him on the podcast here today. So welcome, Alan Aragon. Do you guys know how difficult it is to find a high quality supplement line that doesn't just destroy your gut? Most pre-workouts and post-workouts, or even like on-the-go snack options like beef jerky or protein bars, they're terrible for your gut health. They're full of xanthan gum and guar gums and fillers and artificial sweeteners, which disrupt your gut microbiome and lead to chronic bloating, constipation, diarrhea, and not to mention when our gut is off, all of the other symptoms like hormone imbalances, thyroid issues, mental health issues, which is why I'm just obsessed about gut health. But anywho, I have not been able to find a good supplement line out there, and I had to cut out all of these fitness type supplements when I was really struggling with a lot of my own gut issues. Until recently, I found Paleo Valley. And Paleo Valley is one of the first supplement companies that hands down is incredible for your gut health, whether you're on a gut healing journey or you're someone who just wants to optimize your gut health and overall health. Their founder, Autumn, actually suffered with IBS herself. So she created this entire supplement line specifically to be gut friendly. And I'm not lying with you guys. Their whey protein powder, which is grass-fed and finished, gum-free, artificial sweetener-free, no issues, no bloating, no constipation, no diarrhea, no upset stomach, which is literally like the first time in my entire life that I've not had issues with the protein powder. And they even have super yummy grass-fed and finished beef jerky sticks, which are made with a collagen casing instead of the typical citric acid casing, which is terrible for your gut health. And if you want to try out some of their other products, they even have a bone broth protein powder. I love adding that into whether it's like my oatmeal in the morning or my protein shakes. It literally tastes like the Nestle hot chocolate powders, if you ever had those as a kid, which were not gut friendly. And then they have great supplements too, like their apple cider vinegar capsules or even their turmeric capsules, which are great for inflammation and gut health. So if you want to get a discount, you can use my code using the link in the show notes here, which is paleovalley.com/Rachel Scheer podcast. But all of that's going to be in the show notes. So check out the supplement line because, guys, you know me, I would not have this on my podcast if it was not awesome and gut friendly. Hey everyone, this is Optimal Body RX, and I have Alan Aragon joining me here today. Alan, you are a nutrition researcher and educator with over 30 years of success in the field, and you've been known as one of the most influential figures in the fitness industry's movement towards evidence-based information. That's huge. And I'm excited to get to pick your brain a little bit today about optimal body composition. But just diving in here, what is your opinion of an optimal body composition?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me on, Rachel. It's really a pleasure. And as far as my opinion on optimal body composition, it varies with the individual. But if we're looking at statistical norms, for women, it's somewhere in the low 20s to low 30% that you have this lowered risk for chronic disease and mortality and so forth. And that statistical norm amongst men, and we're talking about the general population, is roughly low teens to low 20s. So it's easy enough to think about those healthy ranges as about 20 to 30 for women and about 10 to 20% for men. And anytime that you're above or below those ranges, you're either looking at competitive athletes in season, or you're looking at people who are overweight or obese. So Yeah.
Okay, so 10 to 20% for men, 20 to 30% ideally for women. And I would imagine muscle plays a big role as well too, because you could be relatively, I mean, on the what we would say lower percent body fat side, but muscle is going to fluctuate quite a bit there. So I know sometimes it's hard to differentiate what is more ideal overall. But what would
Sure.
you say, I guess, in terms of like body composition, what would you say is like the goal to get to in terms of like muscle mass and overall fat? If I know it's kind of a bit more opinion based.
Sure, sure. That in the middle of those ranges seems to be somewhat ideal because you're combining a physically active lifestyle with a certain level of athletic ability, with the element of realistic sustainability. So if men can hover in the mid-teens, then they are reaching that kind of intersection of sustainability and being physically fit. And with women, if they can be maybe more towards the mid 20s, and arguably the high 20s are just fine, then they're reaching that intersection of sustainability, just general health and doability, and also maintaining a degree of physical fitness that protects from all kinds of ravages of age and stuff. So
I haven't asked this to anybody else I've interviewed, and we've talked about like women having, a bit of a higher percent body fat. But why is that important, or why do women, need to have a higher percent of body fat percent, a higher body
yeah,
fat percentage?
yes, there's a couple things with women that are a little bit more crucially dependent on body fat levels. So with women, once you start getting below 20% and certainly towards the mid to low teens, you'll witness either disruption or cessation of the menstrual cycle. And that is a sign that you're hormonally off, in the sense that you can incur long-term damage, especially to the skeletal system. So the so-called female athlete triad is this combination of overexercising and low energy availability, and that leads to menstrual disruption. And when menstrual disruption and cessation happens, that tends to be a lead in towards bone degeneration. So the kind of the long-term adverse outcome of that would be osteopenia, osteoporosis. And in women, or actually with osteoporotic patients, 80% of them are women. And so that kind of speaks to the importance of not maintaining low energy availability to the point that you're constantly chasing this lean ideal, when women are perfectly fine in the 20% to low 30% as far as body fat percent goes.
Yeah, and visually, I know they look different too, right? Like a woman at 23% actually looks very different, at least from what I've seen from like a guy at 23%. And I'm not sure if that's just where we carry fat more around the
Yes,
in the thigh
absolutely.
area, where I've
Mm-hmm.
seen women have, six pack abs closer to 20%.
Mm.
I can usually still maintain a six pack, where a guy oftentimes at 20% body fat, it visually looks very different. So I think it's just important for people to kind of understand like the body fat percentages, because a lot of women are like, oh, well, 20% is high, but visually, that is still very aesthetically pleasing. And I know a lot of the people are after, right, of the aesthetics who are listening to this overall.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And the distribution of body fat across just the body is very different for men and women. And that's correct. A 20% on a woman would look very, very different from 20% on a man, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about diet. What would you
Mhm.
say is the optimal diet for body composition? First, for building muscle, and then second, for fat loss?
That is a huge
A big
question,
question.
Rachel. That's a tremendous question. Okay, so the ideal body, or rather, the ideal diet for fat loss. There's a pretty huge range of diet types that would apply similarly, and they would all depend on the individual's personal preference. So if we were to look at, let's say, macronutrition distribution or macronutrition composition or breakdown, the only, in quotes, non-negotiables are that you get enough protein and that you are imposing a net caloric deficit by the end of the day, or maybe more appropriately by the end of the week. And then you string a bunch of weeks together. So those are the non-negotiables. And the elements that can vary widely across individuals is the proportion of carbohydrate and fat. And this should be driven mainly by personal preference. And in some cases, athletic goal would play a role in, carbohydrate content of the diet, depending on the demands of the competition or sport, if that's the individual that we're talking about. So that would be it for diet composition for fat loss. Get enough protein, make sure you are netting hypocaloric conditions by the end of the week. And then whether you go high carb, whether you go moderate carb, or whether you go low carb or very low carb keto, that's really up to the individual and what they want to try to sustain for that time period that you're losing body fat. Okay, so for gaining muscle, it's very similar, except there's a little wrinkle there with carbohydrate intake, where ketogenic diets that have 50 grams or less of carbohydrate per day, they tend to be inefficient at putting on lean body mass. It's just difficult to do because there's you walk around with lower resting glycogen levels. You don't necessarily have the work capacity that would accommodate escalating volumes and training loads. And frankly, some people are just satiated to a degree that it's tough for them to actually maintain a caloric surplus that would facilitate weight gain. So you have those elements acting against you if you want to gain muscle, but you want to do it on keto. So yeah, aside from that, if you can just simply maintain a net caloric surplus by the end of the week and get adequate protein, then you have a lot of leeway as far as carbohydrate and fat proportion of the diet, with the exception of going very low carbohydrate keto. Then it makes it tough to actually gain muscle efficiently. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying there's not people out there ketoing and gaining muscle.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it doesn't happen maximally or to an optimal degree.
So what I'm hearing you say is, optimal diet, because we can go into a lot of different rabbit holes, and it's probably very dependent on the person, genetics, body type. Are you someone who's more lean? Me and Gabrielle are both like very lean body types overall, versus somebody who's maybe, I don't know if this is still a thing, but it'd be like the ectomesomorph type body. It's where maybe they struggle to, lose a little bit of fat. I'm sure, diet, and then like you said, sustainability will play a big role in that. But all in all, people need to be getting enough protein and being in a calorie deficit in order to lose weight. So I want to touch on that first and then come back to muscle gain. How much of a calorie deficit should people be in for optimal fat loss? Because I know some women can hear that and think, okay, I'm going to just cut my calories as low as possible and then just try to drink a bunch of protein shakes all day long. So what would be the optimal calorie deficit? And then how much protein should they be getting in for fat loss?
Sure. Okay. So caloric deficit from a very kind of high level, just vague and generally applicable standpoint, it's right around 10 to 20% below your current maintenance levels is what you would want to shoot for as far as imposing a caloric deficit. And you would skew a little bit more towards the 20% deficit if you have the extra or excess body fat to lose. And then you would target more of a subtle caloric deficit, like the 10%, if you're already relatively lean and you still want to get leaner. And this is because the more body fat you carry at the starting point, the less prone to losing lean body mass you'll be as you target an aggressive caloric deficit. So we can take people who are obese and severely obese, and you can impose pretty massive deficits like 20, 30, sometimes 40% below their predicted maintenance, and they would still retain lean body mass as they're losing body fat. But if you take somebody who's normal weight, normal body fat percent, and you put them on like a 30, 40% caloric deficit, they're still going to lose body fat, but they're also going to lose an undue amount of lean body mass along with it. So there's this concept called high quality weight loss, meaning you are preserving your lean body mass and you're losing body fat while you're keeping that lean body mass. And there's some pretty solid research in this area, and it was done by Garth and colleagues, where they took elite athletes from a variety of sports who were already lean, and they put one group on a diet that allowed them to lose 1.4% of their total body weight per week. And they put another group on a more subtle caloric deficit where they only lost half of that. So 0.7% of their total body weight lost per week. So the 0.7% group preserved lean body mass while losing body fat, while the 1.4% per week group lost body fat, but also lost lean body mass along with it. So that gives us a pretty major clue that the leaner you are, the more of your lean body mass is threatened by dieting. And so the more subtle you have to be with that deficit. So as a general rule, if you can keep your weight loss down to, well, if we were to use absolute numbers, like 1 to 2 pounds a week is plenty as far as a target for weight loss per week, while still maintaining lean body mass. Now, the 2 pounds a week group is going to be the overweight and obese population, while the 1 pound a week group is going to apply more to people who are slightly overweight or normal weight to begin with, and they're trying to push the envelope. So that's kind of the range that we're looking at. And if you wanted to talk in proportional terms, and this is something that my colleagues and I published, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. So when, for example, you're dieting for a bodybuilding competition and you want to preserve lean body mass, then you wouldn't want to lose more than 1% of your total body weight per week. And preferably, if you keep it to 0.5% of your total body weight per week, then you are increasing your chances that you're going to be preserving your lean body mass while you're losing fat mass.
Yeah. So fast isn't always better. And I think a lot of people, it's how can I get this fat off of me as much as possible? And for the listeners here, I pulled out my pound of fat I've had since I've been a nutritionist here. This is a pound of fat for everyone who's watching. Like this is a decent amount of fat that you're losing every single week. And for people who are more overweight, I wanted to buy the 5 pound fat, but it was like, it's expensive to buy fake fat. I don't realize how much it is, but it's a good amount of fat overall. And when I show that to people, they're like, oh, wow, I'm not mad about just losing 1 pound of fat overall. But why is that a big deal, for the listeners to lose muscle while they're losing fat?
Sure. Losing muscle while you're losing fat is detrimental in at least 2 major ways. Number one, at the end of the fat loss rainbow, if you lost an excessive amount of lean body mass, then the body senses a survival crisis. It senses an energy crisis. So at the end of that dieting period, when you've lost a bunch of lean mass, there'll be a tendency for your appetite to be a lot more raging versus if you kept that lean body mass and just lost body fat. And so for those of you who like to dig through the literature, that phenomenon is called collateral fattening. If you want to just dig that up in PubMed, there's a bunch of good papers on that concept where people lose too much lean body mass while they lose body fat. So, okay, so the appetite issue is one thing. The other thing is just metabolic capacity. So the amount of calories that you burn in a 24-hour period is influenced most profoundly by your lean body mass. And so the more you preserve in terms of your lean body mass while you're losing body fat, then the better you preserve your resting metabolism. So your 24-hour caloric burn. And there are all kinds of ways to lose weight, but if you're losing lean mass just precipitously, then that weight loss is not going to last because your appetite will be up, your 24-hour caloric energy expenditure or your 24-hour energy expenditure will be down. And that's a setup for weight regain.
Mm-hmm. And do you think people should actually increase their protein intake the greater the rate of fat loss, or even depending on how lean they are? Because I know, like, when I was a bodybuilder, like, I ate way more protein than I probably even eat now. Like, I definitely hit 1 gram per pound of my total body weight currently, but I was like up to probably way even more, but 200 grams of protein. It was not optimal for health, but that's what you do when you compete at a very high level. It's not healthy.
Oh yeah, so extreme. Wow.
And ancient.
See what kind of
Yeah.
see what came out of your mouth with. So yeah, the observational data, because it's really tough to set up an experiment to root these things out. But the most successful (1 to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight). So that's right around 2.2 to 3.3 grams. And just observational literature on physique competitors. So as Jim Rohn is somewhat famous for saying, success leaves clues. So we look at the most successful people in the particular department. In this case, the top 5 placing bodybuilders, and in this case, a natural competition. And they really are pushing, most commonly, I would say 1.2 to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. So yeah, you were kind of right in that margin, upper end of that margin.
Yeah. And I think my weight even was at, I don't even know, 110 pounds at the time, being 5'5". So I was itty bitty for sure. And I mean, as a byproduct,
Oh,
had all my health issues after, especially gut issues, right? I was in such a catabolic breakdown state in general, appetite, everything. So I can relate to that. And maybe that's a good speaking point. But, a lot of people look at a bodybuilder's physique and they say this is an optimal body composition, but it's not necessarily an optimal body composition, because what you said is 10 to 20% for men,
yeah,
10% maybe, for more as aesthetics. And then for women, that's 20 to 30%. I'm competing close to 10%, 13% at times, but I think my lowest was at 10%. And I'd love for you to talk why that's not optimal, in optimal body composition for health. And honestly, I like the way I look better now anyway.
Yeah, there's a psychological risk for trying to maintain the lower limits of body fat. So the psychological risk has to do with people courting a pathological relationship with food. So it can really kind of stoke and exacerbate obsessive behaviors and obsessive compulsion with food behaviors. And over time, that can either lead to the development of an eating disorder or disordered eating, or it can just exacerbate or inflame a pre-existing eating disorder. And the insidiously bad thing about that stuff kind of goes back to how low energy availability, especially in women, can impact hormone levels to the degree that they impact bone mineral density. And that's kind of the sleeper problem with low energy availability, especially in women.
Yeah. And we see that in women who aren't just at a very low body composition too, right? We see that a lot with women who are just deficient in skeletal muscle mass or haven't prioritized protein throughout their life. And maybe they've dieted, been in low calorie diets. So then they go through phases of overeating and they get to what we call skinny fat, under muscled, over fat, where their body composition actually for some women could be probably above 30%, but it's not so much that they have too much fat on their body, but that they're under muscled and they've lost a good amount of skeletal muscle mass over time, right? And now metabolically, they're not in the best place. And that can play, I know, a pretty big role, like muscle, protein, and bone density as well for women.
Oh yeah, for sure. And especially as we get older, there's already the threat of age-related muscle loss as people, especially as they enter middle age, and 50 seems to be the magic age where people's lean body mass just starts dropping off annually, mainly from inactivity. But if you're chasing leanness chronically during the life cycle, then that can add to the treachery of age-related muscle loss and the negative metabolic cascade that's associated with losses of muscle tissue.
Yeah, and I want to definitely dive into longevity here in a minute in terms of protein and calorie restriction, but kind of jumping gears here a little bit on the muscle gain side of everything.
Sure.
In terms of macros, what would or would it look any differently for muscle gain? I know calories would look different, right? You want to be in a little bit of a calorie surplus.
Yeah.
But what would the macros look like? I know you said that carbs are a bit more important here when we're trying to build as well.
Yeah, there, like I said, there is that threshold of carbohydrate intake that appears to be detrimental, and that's the keto threshold. And the minimum amount of carbohydrate that is at least observationally associated with being kind of the ability to maximize muscular gains is 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, and that's carbohydrate. So you want to be able to get that as a minimum if, in fact, your goal is to maximize rates of muscle gain. And with protein, that figure, and this is, the gaps in the literature here are pretty huge, because people with the goal of maximizing muscular hypertrophy, they're just not very highly studied in the literature. There's not this rich history of literature studying that population. But in the resistance trained population, and in the literature, when we say resistance trained, most of the time it's people who've been training for 6 months qualify for being labeled resistance trained. And so that's kind of an issue, because then you have this big gray area as far as the actual protein needs of highly trained or more advanced trainees. So with that caveat out of the way, it appears that a range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or in imperial terms, 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight, that appears to be the sweet spot for the pursuit of maximal rates of muscle gain. And they're always kind of, the question arises, like, does that figure apply to obese individuals? Like, how wouldn't you be overprescribing if you told somebody, for example, who's 300 pounds to eat 300 grams of protein? And the answer is, well, maybe, yeah. So the simple solution to that is basing that protein target on your goal body weight, or in quotes, ideal body weight, instead of saying just, current body weight, regardless of where you're at.
Okay. So that
So that's carbohydrate and protein. Yeah.
0.7 to
As
1
far,
gram per pound of
Mhm.
ideal body weight for protein is a
That's
bit
right.
more. So
That's
it's
right.
almost to like protein, would you say is more important actually in a calorie deficit? Of course, it's important on both sides, but more important even in a calorie deficit than even when we're trying to build muscle.
I would say yes. Yes. And that's because there's just a greater threat to lean body mass in hypocaloric conditions. And, the body kind of takes what it needs to survive. And sometimes muscle is the sacrifice there. So yeah, I agree with that protein needs would tend to go up during hypocaloric conditions. As far as dietary fat goes in the topic of muscle gain, it appears that going too low in dietary fat can compromise testosterone production. And testosterone has a very consistent relationship with our ability to put muscular size on, and size and strength for that matter, and physical performance across the board. So the amounts of dietary fat associated with compromised testosterone production are 20-ish% of total calories and below. So if you can hover somewhere above 20% of your total calories, your total caloric intake from dietary fat, then you're doing what you can to avoid these kind of danger zones for low testosterone production.
Yeah. And I think too, when we go really low with fats, people's blood sugar tend to be all over the place too. I know when I was more carbs, more protein, I mean, I felt like I wanted to eat everything in sight, and kind of what you attested to earlier, fats are definitely more satiating, which is why it's hard to put on a decent amount of weight if you're doing a higher fat diet and maybe a lower carb diet, not to mention maybe the insulin response that is not there as much too when we're low carb overall. So this is really helpful. What are your thoughts on fasting for fat loss and then muscle gain?
Sure. Okay, so fasting antagonizes muscle gain in at least three different ways. And I realize that some people will say that, oh, okay, well, fasting, it evokes a growth hormone response, which is a good thing for gaining muscle, but that view is taken way out of context, because transient increases in growth hormone, in the case of fasting, it's more like the body panicking. And the analogy that I draw there is when growth hormone is elevated as a result of energy intake restriction or caloric deprivation completely, it's analogous to the power going out in let's say a building, and the emergency lights coming on. So that growth hormone release as a result of fasting would be the emergency lights coming on, because the power grid was just shut off in the whole building. And so fasting is never a net anabolic event. And we've got a few different lines of evidence to demonstrate this. But at the mechanistic level, hypocaloric conditions, period, and caloric restriction, period, for any real length of time, and even for as little as 1 or 2 days, what you can observe reliably is a decrease in muscle protein synthesis. So fasting antagonizes muscle protein synthesis. It also antagonizes what we call anabolic signaling. So there are certain anabolic signaling molecules that contribute to the overall process of muscle growth. And so anabolic signaling is down, muscle protein synthesis is down. And then the third factor in how fasting antagonizes muscle growth is that when you have low energy availability, you have lower work capacity. And a a non-negotiable tenet of muscle growth is a growth in or an increase in training volume load over time. And so if you don't supply the incoming energy to accommodate escalations in the amount of sets and reps and load that you do, then you're compromising gains in hypertrophy ultimately. So that's a really, really long way to say that there's nothing anabolic about fasting. So on to the
Real quick there, is there
yeah.
a point where like fasting becomes, let's say, detrimental, right? Because some people will hear this and be like, I need to eat first thing when I wake up in the morning.
Mm.
Then they'll eat all day long, and then they're like, I need to eat right up until bed. And the fear is I'm not going to be able to build muscle because that fasting, or any time, and if I miss 3 hours between my meals, I'm going to catabolize all my muscle and it's going to kill my gains. I've heard that before. So it's like, eat right away, eat constantly throughout the day, because that's going to kill your muscle. So I also kind of want to speak to the opposite side.
Yeah.
One,
Yeah.
and what your definition of fasting is, and where
Yeah.
this can be more, I don't want to say detrimental, but can inhibit muscle gain.
Okay, that is a really good concept to bring up, because what I was mainly talking about was, for example, alternate day fasting, where you go 24-hour periods every other day without eating anything at all. And certainly going consecutive day fasting, where you go like 2 days or more without eating anything at all. When you're looking at within the day distribution of meals, the body is just really, really accommodating and really resilient with, even if you were to have one meal a day, for example, you could still gain muscle on one meal a day. And I'm observationally, a lot of people have done it. It just won't be as efficient. For example, if you require, let's say, 2,500 or 3,000 calories for a given individual to target a caloric surplus for muscle gain, it's just kind of logistically challenging to get it in one meal a day,
Full
right?
belly. Yeah.
And yeah, and so there's a practicality limit there to how low you can go in terms of meal frequency within a day and still be able to sustain a proper program for gaining muscle. For most people, it's like a minimum of 2 meals, but here's the gray area in our knowledge. There's not enough research comparing, for example, something very typical like 3 meals a day, or let's call it 3 protein feedings a day, with a higher number of feedings than that, like significantly higher, let's say 5 or 6. And we compare those two protein intake distributions over time in resistance trainees, let's say for like an 8 or 12 week period, which is typical of the feasibility of research studies. And then we see what happens at the end of the rainbow with respect to changes in body composition. In this case, increases in lean body mass or muscle mass. We just don't have that. We just don't have that literature. We have the short-term literature showing that more frequent doses of protein at a particular dosing threshold results in greater muscle protein synthesis by the end of, let's say, a 24-hour period than other distributions. So just to give you an example, so Areta and colleagues, they compared 2 distributions of protein intake. Actually, no, they compared three distributions. So it was an 80-gram total dose of protein, which is a limiting in and of itself, but bear with me for a second. So they compared 8 10-gram doses with 2 40-gram doses with 4 20-gram doses. And they looked at the muscle protein synthesis cumulatively over the course of the day in those 3 distributions. And the highest muscle protein synthesis came from the 4 20-gram doses, even more so than the 8 10-gram doses or the 2 40-gram doses. And this was in highly artificial conditions. But this gives us kind of a clue as to it may matter. Protein distribution through the day, it might make an impact on the maximal capacity for muscle gain. If somebody was their main goal in life was to expedite their muscle gain, that was their main goal in life. Brad Schoenfeld and I, we actually looked at this question, like, what can we do to maximize that process? And looking at all the research as a whole across all the age groups, it appears that if you can maximize the anabolic response per protein feeding, so you want to maximize muscle protein synthesis for a given protein feeding, that protein dose is going to be somewhere between 30 to possibly 50-ish grams, depending on the person's age, depending on the program. There's various bits of research supporting that lower end and the upper end there. And so we work from the top down to figure this out. Okay. So the amount of protein that maximizes muscle gain on just a total daily dosing basis is somewhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Okay. So, and when you look at the amount that maximizes muscle protein synthesis per dose, it's somewhere between 0.4 to 0.55 grams of protein. We just rounded up to 0.6. So 0.4 to 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is the protein dose that maximizes muscle protein synthesis per meal. And so when you take those two figures, the total daily dose and the per meal dose, you just basically do the math, and it comes out to 4 doses over the course of the day, 4 protein doses dosed at roughly 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this is what would, at least in theory, maximize rates of muscle growth. And protein is kind of a unique macronutrient in that aspect, where distribution through the day would matter as far as maximizing net muscle protein synthesis.
So if I were to summarize this for everybody, what I'm hearing is 4 meals per day is more optimal for muscle protein synthesis. And depending on the weight of the person, it could be anywhere between, I know you said 40 to 50 initially, but
yeah,
smaller,
30.
it could be maybe 30
Mm-hmm.
to 50 grams per
Yeah.
meal. Awesome. I'm doing good then.
Yes, yes.
I love
And can I throw in a little caveat there, Rachel? It's like, it could probably, honestly, it could, unless you're a high level competitor where gold or silver is at stake, first or second place is at stake. I personally think most people, recreational trainees, weekend warriors, I personally think they can maximize their muscle gain goals with 3 protein feedings a day and up. I don't think it's going to make much difference for that general population.
Personally, for me, I find I do best 3 meals per day, and then a protein shake thrown in there too, just for optimizing the body, keeping it easy though.
Yes.
Awesome.
That's a good plan.
In terms of fasting for weight loss,
what
are your thoughts there?
It's a viable tool. It's perfectly fine. I mean, I remember 15 years ago when intermittent fasting first hit the scene, a lot of us in the physique culture and the sports and nutrition community, like, oh, this is freaking terrible. People are going to be losing muscle doing this fasting thing, whether it's time restricted feeding, confining your eating to, like, let's say an 8-hour window in the day or less, or whether it's even an every other day fasting or a twice a week fasting type of model. There's different kinds of fasting models we can talk about. But it turns out, I mean, over the last, especially decade of research on the different fasting variants compared to daily caloric restriction, there just isn't any consistent advantage to daily caloric restriction versus intermittent caloric restriction. They are pretty much equal in their effectiveness for weight loss and fat loss, and also for improving clinical markers like blood lipids and glucose control. They're pretty much equivalent. And people who have really become enamored with the idea that intermittent fasting is something special, they get really disappointed when they hear that. But as somebody who works with a variety of individuals like yourself, you would probably hear that and go, oh, well, that's great. Now we have more options on how to individualize the weight loss or fat loss program, because some people are going to really take well to fasting and any number of the intermittent fasting variants, while others will do much better on a linear daily caloric restriction type of model. And that's perfectly fine. So that's kind of the big breakthrough that we've really settled on over the past decade, is that fasting is a legit and effective and, for the most part, safe option for weight loss, especially when you compare it to traditional types of dieting.
Okay. I have two questions about this. Well, I guess my first is more of a comment about it, but I would imagine like behaviors play a big role in what's going to be more optimal for the person. And I think a lot of people who do really well with intermittent fasting, like I like it for more productivity reasons in the morning. I don't want to have to like wake up and eat. I'm like working, I'm getting in my workout. I can work out fasted pretty okay, come back and eat a high protein meal after, and I feel totally fine. I've trained my body to do that overall. I like it for productivity reasons, but I know for a lot of people who do intermittent fasting, it's beneficial for less opportunities to overeat, right? Where most people, when they sit down, it's like, oh, I didn't even realize like I was hungry, and they just want to continue to eat and eat and eat. So if there's less opportunity to eat and it's in a shorter window, at least, I think, a lot of people benefit from weight loss a bit more than maybe, meals spread out throughout the day, in terms of just more so behavior control a bit there.
Yeah, agreed on that. And there's a consistent literature showing that intermittent fasting is really effective for folks who would rather not spend any effort or energy calculating out an energy deficit for the day.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So people who would rather eat ad libitum, so in other words, eat unrestrictedly. So there's a consistent literature showing that time restricted eating, if you just restrict your eating to a certain portion of the day, whether it's the earlier part of the day or whether it's the later part of the day, it barely matters. Then you'll automatically eat less. Now, that this also happens with alternate day fasting. You can just eat as desired, unrestricted, but if you just essentially eat every other day, you're going to net a caloric deficit by the end of the week. And this even applies with twice a week fasting, where you choose 2 days in the week where you severely skimp your way through or don't eat anything at all. You still end up, even if you eat ad libitum or unrestricted on the other 5 days, there's this tendency to net a caloric deficit by the end of the week. So one of the neat little things about the fasting models, the intermittent fasting models, is that they tend to exempt people from micromanaging and trying to create this caloric deficit where you number crunch it through and you really try to impose that daily. It exempts them from that, which is kind of neat.
Yeah. So it could be beneficial for somebody if it works well with their routine, their schedule, kind of what their eating preferences are. If they don't want to calculate, calorie deficit, they just like, I want to eat. So I just want to restrict the times when I am eating, maybe do some extended fasts in there. Is there a point in an extended fast where someone does begin to run the risk of loss of skeletal muscle mass? And I'm sure body composition plays a bit of a role in that too, depending on where they're at. If they're, a guy who's close to 10% body fat, a guy above 20% body fat. But is there a point where you're pretty okay and you don't have to worry about losing muscle, and then hereafter it becomes a bit more problematic?
That's a great question, Rachel. And one of the reasons why it's such a good question is because we don't have the data on that. We truly do not. There are a couple studies worth discussing that kind of come close to it. Like Templeton and colleagues, they recently compared an alternate day fasting model with a daily caloric restriction model, and they did it in lean, healthy men. So what happened with this group of subjects was in the alternate day fasting group, they lost more lean body mass than the daily caloric restriction group. So apparently, if you're lean, you might not want to go with an alternate day fasting model if you're trying to push the envelope. And in contrast to that, we've got studies just looking at squunching down the feeding window. So time restricted feeding, which is usually an 8-hour window or less. Sometimes they cinch it down to 6 hours ish, 5-6 hours, but it's usually an 8-hour window. That does not appear to have any detrimental effects on the maintenance of muscle mass, on the maintenance of lean mass, especially if there's resistance training in the mix. So you kind of have those two ends, the riskier end where you don't eat for 24 hours, and then the much safer end where you just restrict your calories within the day and make sure there's resistance training there. So yeah, it's tough to answer that question. Like, how far can you push that caloric deprivation before bad things start happening with respect to muscle loss? And I think what we can say is, don't make it a habit of pushing it beyond 24 hours, especially if you're not resistance training.
Yeah. And pay attention to where your current composition is at. I don't do extended fasts. I like the intermittent, but I'm training and I'm not in a calorie deficit still throughout the day when I'm doing it. I'm still getting all my nutrition requirements. I'm just pushing it back a little bit and having a shortened window. So hopefully I'm on the safe side with everything there. That's very helpful.
You probably are. I mean, having been a competitor, I'm sure you kept a close eye on everything, your strength levels, your body comp, and how you feel. And, if you found what works for you as an individual, then hallelujah,
Yeah, I'd say sometimes it's not as optimal in terms of strength in the gym. If I would have eaten a meal right before I walked in, I think overall, like I do fine, I do okay, during that period, and it works well with my lifestyle. If I were to work out in the evening and have eaten all my meals, I might have a bit more energy and strength, just like to push through. Sometimes blood sugar drops in there, but I'll bring some things with me if needed. So cool. Longevity. So muscle loss is pretty common as people get older. The loss of skeletal muscle mass improves. What are some ways people can prevent that to maintain an optimal body composition as they age?
It's surprisingly similar to what younger adults should be doing anyway. So it can be as simple as, and by the way, you're frozen, so I'm hoping you can hear me. Okay, you're not frozen anymore. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we'll fix that. Yeah, we'll edit
You're
that.
Good. You're good. So you can hear me now?
I can.
Okay, good. So for the older population, the guidelines are just surprisingly similar. It's just a matter of maintaining them as you navigate your way through the life cycle as an older adult, and the different stressors and life situations that you may run into that may challenge these things you're supposed to keep doing and maintaining as a younger adult. So with the older adult population, the idea is to get enough protein because they tend not to. And by enough protein, we really want to get a minimum of 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's like, what is that? Like 0.5-ish grams per pound. I would rather see the older adults getting 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.7 grams per pound of, in quotes, ideal body weight. I would rather see them getting that as a minimum. than 1.2. 1.2 is sort of this low end that people throw around in longevity circles and stuff, and they think it's fine. And there's this kind of halo around 1.2. But when you look at the just different lines of evidence, 1.2 always gets outperformed for preserving lean body mass in a deficit, or it'll get outperformed for increasing muscle mass and performance of various athletic activities. And it'll get outperformed by amounts that range anywhere from 1.8 to 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. So I really would like to see 1.6 be the minimum for older adults, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight as a minimum for older adults. And older adults and people in general have to get over the stigma that people carry about resistance training. They think of Olympic lifters just hoisting things and just, they think of people being spotted on the bench press in the gym with the 3 plates per side. And strength training is just the underrated weapon. I mean, muscle is like the longevity organ. I think I think it was Gabrielle who said that. She's got a lot of cool ways to express this. And by the way, Gabrielle is awesome. I love her. She's great. And yeah, so enough protein. Make sure resistance training is in place. As far as minimum effective dose of resistance training to maintain a certain degree of fitness and health, it's pretty small. Like collectively, the evidence indicates that you can maintain strength. And when I say maintain strength, I don't mean as an elite strength athlete, but just maintain strength as something that would be healthy for the general population in as few as 3 to 5 sets total per muscle group per week. I mean, you can get that done in like a half hour, so minimum effective dose to work up from if you want to continue progressing in your fitness levels is very low. So people should realize that you don't have to spend 90 minutes in the gym 5 times a week in order to maximize longevity and get the benefits out of resistance training. All right, so we got protein, we got resistance training, and then the other element that would help people age well is to kind of goes right back to the beginning, is to maintain a healthy level of body fat. So men would not necessarily want to cross over the 20% body fat mark, and women wouldn't necessarily want to exceed like low 30%. If you want to really hedge your bets towards maximizing lifespan and health span and mitigating risk for chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer amongst the non-infectious diseases in the developed world. And so you have those 3 elements: maintaining good body composition, maintaining a resistance training program, and also making sure that you get enough protein. If we can target those things in the older adult population, then we'd be doing a lot for increasing longevity.
What role would you attribute hormone shifts versus just lifestyle playing the bigger role? Because I feel like most people, they're like, oh, I'm losing muscle, I'm putting on fat, I'm getting older, it's because my hormones have shifted. Is this just like a thing that happens when people age? It's just like no matter what? Or is it really just like, okay, you just haven't taken care of yourself very much and it's just catching up with you now?
Well, I kind of think that it can be a combination of both of those things. It is a combination of both of those things, and it varies pretty widely with the individual. I know some guys whose testosterone should be much lower than it is given their age, but it's still high in spite of their age and in spite of not even having hormone replacement therapy. I'm not against hormone replacement therapy. I mean, that's kind of aside from the question that you asked. I think that yes, there are decreases that occur. There are changes that occur hormonally that can challenge individuals' ability to stay healthy and vigorous and strong, and have a high quality of life. I do think that, like, for example, testosterone will decrease over time. This is kind of a funny thing. I had this conversation with a gentleman named John Berardi. He started Precision Nutrition a while ago, and then he sold it. He actually thinks it might be kind of a good thing for men's testosterone levels to drop as they get more mature, so they can stop throwing things out of windows and they can calm down a little bit.
All
You
the
know,
young
you're not.
girls.
Yes, yeah. It's time to slow down a little bit. So, it's almost by design that testosterone decreases, so you can kind of calm down and stop breaking things. You know. But then the other side of the coin is, like, when women start experiencing hormonal changes that make body fat distribution, that the gain of body fat kind of change and be a little bit more biased towards the trunk, or the abdominal adiposity, as it were. It makes it a little more challenging, and it makes it unideal when you gain body fat as a woman in perimenopause or postmenopause. Then that body fat accumulation will have a tendency to be more central rather than, towards the hips and thighs and the periphery of the body. There is that change that happens, but I still think, and this is, oh, but I missed that.
How do you avoid that? The shift to the midsection.
I don't think you can.
Not even HRT. I just
that might help a little bit. That might help a little bit, but I think it's really a matter of keeping overall body fat levels in check and under control. And I think that women in perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, they can still accomplish that. They can still accomplish a more ideal body fat percentage, but kind of with the knowledge that, well, if you gain body fat after a certain age, it's going to be distributed differently than it did pre-menopause. But hey, you should be keeping body fat levels under control anyway, just for general health. And so it can almost be a non-issue unless you let it become an issue. Yeah. So yeah, that's a difficult one.
Becomes more of an issue if you have a higher body fat percentage, but if you keep your body composition more optimal, below 30%, I mean, maybe even closer to 20% as a female, that's less of a problem.
That's correct. That's correct. And I can say that pretty confidently because I've seen a lot of women in their 40s and 50s maintain, and even beyond that, maintain closer to ideal body composition. And this sort of archetypical truncal adiposity that happens with menopausal, peri and postmenopausal women is just not there because they have kept their total body fat levels in check.
Okay. My goal is to have a six-pack still, because I've had one for 15 years and maybe I'm in my 60s. So because
I'm going to root for you the whole way through, Rachel.
So it's good to know. Keep body composition in check. Start when you're younger, because I think it's so hard when women get to that point where they have had the hormonal shift and they haven't focused on skeletal muscle mass and they haven't done any resistance training and getting enough protein. And then we're in this really, really tough place metabolically. And then they come to people like me and they're like, help me lose fat, help me change my body composition. And they're the hardest person to work with. Like, it's not impossible. I could definitely make these body composition shifts, but it's not going to work as optimal as it would have if we promoted optimal muscle protein synthesis when we were younger and did consistent resistance training, even if it's just what you spoke about earlier, where it was minimal amounts, just like using the muscle every single week, because our body just says that if we're not using it, we're going to lose it. type mentality. Most of us work desk jobs. I mean, I even work a desk job. So, I make it an effort to at least, move my body, do some resistance training, even on the weeks where, I got a lot going on overall. So I think it is for anybody's listening, starting now. And if you're listening to Optimal Body RX, you probably already have started, with resistance training and trying to optimize your body composition. But it's what you're doing right now that's going to matter, I'd imagine, so much later on in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing you're dealing with the middle-aged person and up, you're dealing with bad habits that have been in place for decades. And so you're going to grapple with undoing those bad habits, those unproductive, those counterproductive, sabotaging responses to environment. You're going to you have your work cut out for you when you're helping folks who have ingrained those unproductive responses to environment, those bad habits for decades. And that's why it's tough to work with middle-aged population,
Yeah. Habits are hard. We
Mhm.
hold them every single
Yeah.
day. Well, this has been awesome, Alan. Where can people find you and check out all the things that you're doing?
AlanAragon.com. That's the hub. And on social media, my handle is the Alan Aragon. And so I'm probably most active on Instagram and Twitter and occasionally Facebook and very occasionally TikTok, because I don't know, I have too much pride to try to do that well on TikTok.
There's too many platforms now to keep up with, I swear. Well,
Yeah.
everyone check out the Alan Aragon on Instagram. We'll have all of that here in the show notes. And it has been a pleasure. I've learned so much from you. This is Optimal Body RX.
Likewise, Rachel. Thank you.